say you eat a handful of whole nuts. You're actually only absorbing about 70% of those calories. You actually end up pooping out a significant amount of those calories. When you eat pulverized wheat, corn, rice flour in these ultra-processed foods, you're absorbing 100% of those calories.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Max Out. Today is going to be very, very detailed stuff, and it's going to be something that is going to impact you in the way that your brain works, your body works, your entire outlook on life is going to be different. I have a very special man with me here today. I guess he's a health and science journalist. He's a podcaster. He's a researcher. What I know is he's brilliant, and I was telling him off camera, the IQ gap between the two of us is rather significant today. So I'm going to pretend to hang with Max. Today will be the most detailed information you've ever received on your life on food, your body, and how to make yourself more well is the way that I would describe it. So Max Lugavere, welcome to the Max Out Show with Ed Mylett. Great to have you.
Great to be here, and what an appropriate name. I mean, I feel like we're really going to max out today.
We are. I got a Max, and my son's name is Max, by the way, too. So it's very easy for me to remember your name when we're preparing. But I got to tell you, in preparation for this, I'm blown away. When I introduce guests, you know, I want to make sure I do them justice, but also tell the truth. I consider you one of a kind right now in the world, in the way that you think, you articulate, the breakthroughs you've discovered already about the body, the mind, and how food in particular impacts it. So today, guys, is going to be very, very special. But what I want to do, I think you found your calling, and I think it's just important for my audience to know that maybe a lot of people listen to my show, they don't know what their calling is yet. And I don't think you knew what yours was until the situation started with Mom, right? And that just sort of changed your life. So just tell everybody how you even began the journey of being so great at what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. And I've, heard wonderful things about you, and I've been a fan for a while, so it's a real privilege to be here. But I'm glad that you've allowed me the opportunity to start with my why, because it really was, something really tragic that occurred in my personal life that set me off down this path. I never, if you would have asked me 10 years ago what the next 10 years of my life was going to look like, I never would have predicted what I'm currently doing right now. The reality is I was a pre-medical student in college, but I ended up pivoting and going into journalism. So I used to work for a news and information TV network in the United States, where I was a bit of a generalist. I liken myself to having been a stem cell at the time, undifferentiated. And although I got to cover, my passions, which, tend to be health, nutrition, science related, I really didn't have a singular focus like I do now. It wasn't until about 6 years after taking on that role that in my personal life, my mother got sick. And as anybody with a sick loved one knows, I mean, the world basically stops when that happens. And my mom was young at the time. She was about 58 years old. And this was in 2011, where she started to complain of brain fog. And brain fog is a term that you often hear thrown about in, wellness literature aimed towards lay people. But when, from one day to the next, your mother starts complaining about this thing that she never had, previously experienced, it becomes really unsettling. But I had no prior family history of any type of dementia, any type of neurodegenerative disease. So I was like, it's just probably part of getting older, But in tandem with that, my mom there was a change to her gait, which is the way that a person walks. And the combination of the fact that it had seemed like almost as if overnight she had a brain transplant with somebody 30, 40 years her senior, and the fact that suddenly her stride had begun to look more like a shuffle. It was just really, I realized that it was something that I had to step in and get involved with and go with my mom to these various doctor's appointments to try to see what was going on. I had no framework for understanding dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, which are terms that ultimately not only would I become very familiar with, but I would end up dedicating my career to understanding, sort of the mechanisms underlying them. But in every doctor's office, what I experienced with my mom, I've come to call diagnose and adios. Basically, you go to a doctor's office, they run a battery of esoteric tests, and they send you on your way. But it wasn't until 2011 at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. And mind you, I grew up in New York City, which is where my mom lives. We have access to great hospitals in New York City, but we literally had to travel to Cleveland, Ohio, one of the top, cathedrals to academic medicine that there is in the United States, to get some kind of diagnosis for my mom. And it was there for the first time that she was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease. And that was, for me, it was like, the sound effect in a movie of like the record stopping. All of my prior interests, passions kind of fell to the background, and I became singularly focused on understanding to the best of my ability why this would have happened to my mom, what could be done to help her slow down the progression of the disease, and in tandem with that, what could be done to prevent cognitive decline from being something that I ever have to contend with, or something that others that I care about have to deal with. And so that became really my life's mission, to understand all the various diet and lifestyle factors that come into play when discussing how to optimize the way that our brains work and to shield our brains against decay in the long term.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, by the way, about your mom. And
Thank you.
but I wanted you to start with that because you guys, Max always obviously been a very bright guy, but he was a guy before this happened, right? A guy. And now he's literally changed millions of people's lives, millions, and including mine. And just so you know, sometimes the greatest tragedies in your life are going to spur the calling of your life, and be open to that. Be open to the possibility that maybe you haven't fallen, maybe these times you think that are so difficult for you right now, maybe the seeds are being planted of the rest of your life and the work you're going to do. So let's get into it. Let's get into some. Now, I want to tell you, I haven't told you this off camera. I have some vascular issues, cardiovascular disease that I discovered early. And so I am interested in vascular health just in general. So I have maybe a little bit more knowledge than the layman, just because I've been trying to do research for myself. I've got a wonderful doctor named Amy Doneen that treats me. But I want to talk a little bit about insulin just to begin with. And its impact, its impact overall. I know about inflammation in the body, but also on dementia and Alzheimer's specifically. And speak a little bit, if you can, about insulin, and then finding metabolic dysfunction in the brain when it's impeding the brain's ability to produce energy early on. Those two things, if you could start with that.
Yeah, I mean, just as you're talking, when discussing cardiovascular disease, when you have chronically elevated insulin, so it's a condition called hyperinsulinemia, it causes your body to hold on to sodium, which can actually raise blood pressure. And blood pressure, having chronically elevated blood pressure, hypertension, which is something that many, many adults have. I don't quote me on the statistic. It's very high. It's also starting to emerge in people, at ages way younger than we would expect to see hypertension. But that's one of the most common modifiable risk factors for dementia. And I use the term modifiable because we know how to basically counteract high blood pressure in our bodies. But when we are eating diets that cause that hormone insulin to stay chronically elevated, it causes your kidneys to hold on to sodium, essentially. And on just one day, 24 hours of a low carbohydrate diet, you cut the amount of insulin secreted by your pancreas in half. So for anybody experiencing chronically elevated levels of insulin, this is worthwhile to know. And so just to do a little primer, insulin is a hormone secreted by your pancreas that causes your muscle cells and your liver to basically suck up glucose that's in the blood. So whenever you eat, and this is totally physiologically normal. So whenever you eat brown rice, or a bagel or anything with carbohydrates in it, even, just regular old table sugar, your pancreas responds sort of like a blunt instrument. It secretes, some of this hormone, and it causes glucose to be taken up by your muscle cells and your liver. And that's totally okay, when used acutely. The problem is today, your average American is sedentary and consumes about 300 grams of carbohydrates every single day. So we live in a state of chronically elevated levels of insulin. Yep. And insulin is not inherently bad, but the problem is that insulin is a very powerful growth hormone. And it's also used in metabolism. It's crucially important in terms of dictating the energy substrate that your body is using as a fuel source. And so when you have chronically elevated levels of insulin, it not only prevents you from using fat as a fuel source, which is, not a trivial point because your brain loves to use fat for fuel. In fact, 60% of the energy that your brain can make has the ability to come from fat.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we basically prevent our brains from being able to use fat as a fuel source because we're in this state of chronically elevated insulin levels.
Okay.
And so, the sodium point I think is really important. But, when it comes to vascular health, your brain is fed blood and nutrients, oxygen included, by a network of microvessels. So any sort of outage along that pathway is going to lead to cognitive dysfunction. And in fact, the second most common form of dementia is called vascular dementia. So for anybody with cardiovascular issues, you really want to make sure that you're staying up on that. And we can talk about, the sort of dietary and lifestyle practices that I think can be helpful in that context.
Let's stay on there really quick. Just a very simple thing first, and then we're going to go kind of deep there. I've heard you say that, carbs are not great, but the idea, if you're going to eat your carbs, not having 6 meals a day and spreading these carbs out all day, but potentially that it's more healthy. Maybe if I'm wrong here, to eat your carbs in a concentrated time period and not spread out throughout the whole day.
Yeah. So basically, the thinking there is that, and it depends person to person. So I don't really advocate for a one size fits all dietary paradigm. I think it's different. Athletes are going to have a much higher carbohydrate tolerance than non-athletes, for example. But generally, yes, the research that I've seen and that I cite in my book, Genius Foods, suggests that if you take 100 grams of carbohydrates and you consume those over the course of the day, you're going to secrete a certain amount of insulin to basically clean up those carbohydrates, to get that glucose that those carbohydrates yield out of circulation and into your muscle or into your liver, right? But if you then take that 100 carbohydrates, spread out over 6 meals, for example, and then you concentrate it into one meal, the area under the curve, like the total amount of insulin secreted, I believe is less. So in terms of just, secreting less insulin, over a given window of time, it makes, I think, the most sense. And this is, I think, especially relevant if you are pre-diabetic or if you have type 2 diabetes, or if you're, for whatever reason, you're carefully watching your blood sugar, to be mindful of the amount of when you're basically consuming those carbohydrates. Also, we tend to be more insulin sensitive earlier in the day.
Okay.
So this is where circadian biology comes in. So I would say, it probably makes more sense to eat those carbohydrates earlier in the day.
Okay.
But it's also...
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's also, I think to some degree, it's, the functional and practical implications of this. If your diet is built predominantly around ultra processed, lab made foods, then it's kind of splitting hairs, But if your diet is generally optimized and you're eating predominantly whole, minimally processed foods, then I think that these are really interesting sort of tools that you can play with to just optimize your diet even further.
Okay, that's huge. I'd never heard anybody say that before, right? Like, I'm always this 6 meal a day, kind of the traditional bodybuilding fitness type deal, where I thought I was causing less spikes by doing that. And sounds like that I'm really sustaining the levels of it. It'd be better just to get it out of the way faster. I want to talk about some biomarkers for Alzheimer's and dementia. For example, do you recommend I do a quarterly fasting blood sugar and fasting glucose test, because this pre-diabetic thing is such a concern. Insulin resistance is such a concern. Do you recommend that? And are there any other biomarkers? I just can't get over, Max, how few people ever get their blood drawn. They don't know what's going on in their body. And I think, maybe you recommend it as well. At least once a year at some age, get your labs drawn and see what's going on. What are some of the biomarkers, and do you like those fasting tests?
Yeah, you should always be looking under the hood. I would say at least once a year. So I think you're talking about a fasting blood glucose and a fasting insulin, which can both be actually very useful. So with those two numbers independently are very good at, because for all things being equal, you want to make sure that your blood sugar is within the lower end of the normal spectrum. Because having high fasting blood sugar is just not good. Blood sugar literally can become blood sugar is actually toxic in the blood. You need a certain amount of it, but it damages the proteins of which you are constructed. And so all things being equal, I think you want to make sure that your blood sugar is within a normal, healthy range. And then your insulin also, you want to make sure you're not using a lot, you're not having to use a lot of insulin. Your pancreas isn't having to secrete very much insulin to keep that blood sugar at that normal, healthy level. And so when you actually take both of those numbers, you can do a very simple calculation. Off the top of my head, I can't recall quite how to do it, but it's very easy. I talk about it in my book. But the number that this calculation yields is called the HOMA-IR, which is a useful measure of your insulin sensitivity, or
Yes.
insulin resistance. So we're talking about insulin. Insulin is this hormone. Many people today struggle with insulin resistance, which is sort of the consequence of chronically elevated insulin levels. And the reason why this HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin sensitivity or resistance, is useful is because we can see that having a higher degree of insulin resistance in the body is correlated to a worse ability to generate energy in the brain. So what happens in the brain in dementia is you have something called glucose hypometabolism. So hypo means under. So you have a less than ideal ability to create energy using glucose, which is the primary energy substrate for your brain that's always in circulation to some degree. And we see that if you're insulin resistant in the body, your brain is basically likely struggling to create energy with sugar. So that's a very good test to get, your HOMA-IR. You want to
How
make
early
sure
in life would somebody be susceptible to their brain producing less energy? How would you, at what age would that begin to show itself?
Well, unfortunately, they've shown that people with certain genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease show very small decrements in their ability to generate energy as early as the age of 20. Yeah. So whether or not that correlates to, impaired cognitive function, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. The brain is a very resilient organ, and it's able to use different fuel sources. It's sort of like a hybrid car. But that same hypometabolism we see in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, and it's reduced by about 50%. So that sort of biomarker that's associated with Alzheimer's disease, you can kind of see signs of it very early on in people who are genetically at risk for Alzheimer's disease. And that's not the genetic risk factor that I'm talking about. It's called the ApoE4 allele, which about 1 in 4 people carry. It's not a death sentence to develop dementia by any means, but it is interesting that that people that carry that gene have this reduction in glucose metabolism in their brains, and we know that impaired glucose metabolism is also associated with insulin resistance. So if I happen to be one of those 1 in 4 people that carry that allele, I would be even more diligent about my dietary and lifestyle choices to make sure that I'm staying as insulin sensitive as possible.
Okay.
So,
and guys, we're going to get into what Max recommends at some of those diet and lifestyle choices that he knows benefit you. We're going there in a minute, but I just want to stay, Max, with measurables just for a minute, because I cannot get over how many people I meet in their 30s, 40s, and 50s and have not had a lab drawn in 10 years, 15 years. And so I want to talk a little bit about like plaques, amyloid plaques. I've been doing some research about that. I want you to talk about those a little bit, just what they are for most people's edification. And then for me, when I get my labs drawn, I used to get your normal HDL, LDL, tells you very little. I now get the particle size measured on HDLs and on LDL and lipoprotein little a and all these other markers that I'm tested for that I'm convinced not only affect the heart, but also the brain. And here I am acting like I know, but I'm curious as to your recommendations about these plaque buildups. What's amyloid plaque? Why does it matter? And does particle size matter when you're getting your labs drawn? Most people are like, my HDL is 62. My LDL is, 125 and I'm done. But that's kind of old school, almost not very useful information. Is it not?
No, you're right. In fact, the high HDL thing has really been called into question over the past couple of years. We used to think that anything that you can do that's going to raise your HDL is going to be protective against cardiovascular disease. But they've tested a number of drugs that raise HDL, and they've shown really to be disappointing from the standpoint of cardioprotection.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, high HDL might just be something that occurs in somebody who is otherwise metabolically healthy, and trying to raise it with diet and lifestyle, I don't think is the sort of holy grail of cardioprotection that we, we're hoping that it would have been.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key is you want your HDL to be healthy. You want your HDL to be functional. HDL, as you mentioned, it's a lipoprotein, and lipoproteins are vulnerable to oxidative modification. So, in the presence of sugar in your blood, they can become damaged, these particles. And so you want your HDL and your LDL to be healthy. That really, I think, is the most important thing. I mean, they still look at low HDL as being one of the signs of metabolic syndrome. But really, you know, I think getting a lipoprotein analysis is important. Making sure that your LDL particles are large and buoyant and fluffy, I think, is important.
Yes. No one talks about this. So yes, right. I wanted you to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's what's referred to as pattern A, sort of a pattern, an A pattern of your LDL phenotype. You know, making sure that those particles are basically what happens when your liver creates the majority of cholesterol, you know, in circulation. Your brain creates its own cholesterol. Cholesterol is created locally too, but by and large, your liver creates most of the cholesterol that's in circulation in your blood. And when your liver creates this cholesterol, it gets shipped out on these lipoprotein packages, these LDL particles, and they start out very big and buoyant because they enter circulation carrying a payload of cholesterol and triglycerides, and they get sent around your body. And this is physiologically totally healthy and totally normal. The problem is that some people, you know, whether it's with genes or because of the way that they're eating, they encounter essentially plumbing problems where, you know, before long, normally you want these LDL particles they get smaller and smaller over time while they're in circulation because they're dropping off their, you know, these little packages, basically. It's like a UPS truck. Although UPS trucks don't get smaller, but in this, you know, analogy,
it works.
And so before long, what you want to happen, you know, the liver basically pops up what's called these LDL receptors to basically suck the particles back in. They get disassembled, broken down, used to create bile acids and things like that. And then that whole process starts again. The problem is some people, whether it's through genes, like people who have, you know, any of the many genes that are associated with familial hypercholesterolemia, so it's like genetically elevated problems with their LDL plumbing, or diets that are excessively high in saturated fat. You have a reduction in the receptors, in the LDL receptors on the liver, which can then cause these particles to stay in circulation for too long, you know, in close proximity to, you know, for example, sugar, like chronically elevated, you know, blood sugar can do this. And so they become damaged, and it increases the likelihood that they're going to get stuck in the vessel wall. And that's really where you start to see, I think, the beginning of atherosclerosis.
And that can that affect the brain too, right? I mean, people that are prone to, my family's prone to both. So there's dementia in my family and there's heart disease in my family. And so, you know, these things matter to me. But when it comes to I cut you off there. I apologize. I didn't know you were going to keep going. But is that also true in the brain? Do plaques accumulate in the brain as well, in the vascular areas of the brain, or is that the neck, or how does it impact the brain?
Well, so the same kinds of vascular problems that you can have anywhere in the body, you can have in the microvasculature that feeds blood and nutrients to the brain. So that's where you can start to have a problem from a vascular standpoint. The amyloid plaques and tau tangles that you're referring to, it's sort of a different machinery there, different mechanism.
Okay.
But nonetheless, the same problems that are going to cause this backup of LDL particles in the blood, that's going to cause inflammation in your blood vessels, chronically elevated blood sugar, all incredibly damaging to the brain. There's no question about it. It can create inflammation in the brain, can damage the blood vessels going up to the brain. And inflammation in the brain is really what is responsible, I think, for this increase in amyloid beta and the tau tangles that we see. So when we talk about amyloid beta and tau, these are the sort of hallmark proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. Okay. There are other forms of dementia. You have vascular dementia, as I mentioned. You have Parkinson's disease dementia. You have Lewy body dementia. So dementia is an umbrella category, and Alzheimer's disease is simply the most common form of dementia. And so because it's the most common form of dementia, that's why there's all this research money that goes into it. And so amyloid is most closely associated with Alzheimer's disease. But we all generate amyloid in our brains. It tends to increase as we get older. And for a long time, amyloid was thought of as sort of the analogy that, what cholesterol is to heart disease, amyloid was to Alzheimer's disease. So that analogy works really well. But the same way that we now know that cholesterol is not necessarily the villain in cardiovascular disease, it's sort of like, it's this molecule that's there at the scene of the crime, certainly, but it's not necessarily the causal player. at least in the early stages. The same thing we're now seeing with amyloid. So amyloid for the longest time, because you could easily open up the brain of a deceased person who had died from Alzheimer's disease, and you see these plaques and tangles in the brain. It was thought that amyloid beta was the cause of Alzheimer's disease. So what do we have to do to get this amyloid out of the brain? But many, many drug trials later, what we've seen is that drugs that are actually effective at reducing amyloid burden in the brain don't cure the disease. So the question has then become, what are the earliest problems, or the earliest biomarkers that are associated with Alzheimer's disease that we can intervene on earlier to prevent this amyloid buildup in the first place. And we know that, inflammation in the brain, because the brain doesn't really have an immune system the way that the body does, amyloid seems to be responding to neuroinflammation. We also see that sleep is incredibly important when it comes to keeping the brain clean of these plaques. We know over this, just as of a couple of years ago, there's a newly discovered system in the brain called the glymphatic system, which I think many people are starting to become familiar with, that when you sleep, your brain actually flushes cerebrospinal fluid throughout your brain and cleanses it of these proteins that build up over the course of the day. And the thinking is, the more of the protein that there is lingering in your brain, the higher the odds that it can basically clump and form the plaques and tangles that we associate with Alzheimer's disease. So that's where sleep really comes into play as well.
Okay, I'm glad you went there. So now we're going to shift into thank you, by the way. I'm glad we're going to shift into some practical stuff. So practical thing number one, you need to sleep a bunch. It's healthy for your brain. You don't need to understand why. It just is. That's number one. Number two, yeah. I want to talk at length, well, in some detail, about, you went there earlier, and I'm glad we're going to go there. We're going to talk about what we put in our mouths now. And you said processed foods versus, really healthy, raw, real foods, real meats, real greens, what have you. I eat, like a lot of people, I bet, that listen to the show. If I started to add up how much processed food that I eat in a given day or week, it's pretty scary. I'm talking about protein bars, protein chips, things that at least in my mind, I think are healthy because they're getting me protein, low calorie, really quick, tastes pretty good. It's a snack. But I mean, I eat a ton of processed food. Why is that bad compared to eating I don't know what you would call it, real food every single day?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to make the distinction, right? Like, processed food sort of has this really negative connotation associated with it, especially these days. But when you cook your food, you're processing it. So it's not necessarily that processing is like this evil thing. It's the it's when food has just become so pulverized and removed from its natural form that it's hardly recognizable from its original form. When you take a steak or something, or a piece of like raw meat, and you cook it in your pan, you're processing it. When you put, whole foods in a blender, you're processing that food. The problem with ultra processing, which is what, the food industry does, is it creates foods that are what food scientists refer to as hyperpalatable. It becomes really difficult to moderate your consumption of those foods. These foods are designed to be overconsumed. And by the time you've reached satiety when eating these foods, you've already overconsumed them. You've already...
Wow.
Yeah. They've shown this actually recently. There was a National Institutes of Health study led by an obesity researcher named Kevin Hall. You can look up the study, that found that when people were given an ultra processed diet to consume ad libitum, meaning like you were able to eat whatever you wanted until you reached a point of satiety, they ended up eating a 500 calorie surplus every single day.
Wow.
When just eating to feel full, which is something that every human being wants to feel, right? When eating food, I mean, it's like, it's a privilege and great thing to be able to feel full. And it's something that we all want when we're eating. In the crossover trial, what they then did was that they gave these same subjects access to a minimally processed diet and to the same degree of satiety. So eating also until they were full and satiated. They ended up eating at a calorie deficit of 300 something calories. Yeah. So, I mean, that ultra processed food diet, which, by the way, today is how most people are eating most of the time. 60% of the calories that we consume today come from ultra processed foods. That right there explains the obesity epidemic. Because we're just constantly in proximity to these ultra processed foods where it's really difficult to pump the brakes on them. We end up over consuming them. Yeah. And the other problem with these foods is that they're minimally nutritious. So not only are we walking around, with ever expanding waistlines. 1 in 2 people by the year 2030 are going to be not just overweight, but obese. And half of us are either type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. 90% of us are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. So we're overfed and we're undernourished. And when you put those two features together, that's why you're seeing accelerated aging. You're seeing, I think, just unprecedented rates of cardiovascular disease, of, certain cancers, and of dementia. I mean, because the brain partakes in, whatever's going awry in the body, the brain suffers the consequences of that as well.
And these ultra processed foods, is there an ingredient or two that must be avoided? Like, hey, this is really toxic and bad for your body, when we're looking at the list of ingredients in something, chemicals in there? Is there one or two that are just no-nos?
Well, I love that you asked that question. Really, really getting practical. I think that the kinds of ingredients you really want to watch out for are refined grains. So that's one, and refined grain and seed oils. So refined grains, the wheat flour, the rice flour, the corn flour. I mean, I'm not dogmatic in my approach. Eating a piece of whole corn on the cob is one of my favorite things to eat in the summer. I eat white rice on my sushi. Like, I'm not dogmatic about grains are the devil or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But in these ultra processed foods, I think refined grains really are problematic. I'll give you another reason why, actually, just because it's interesting. When you eat, say you eat a handful of whole nuts, right? Mm-hmm. And you look at the calories in, on the back of the nut package or whatever, and you see we'll just say it's 500 calories worth of whole nuts. You're actually only absorbing about 70% of those calories, because, when you chew whole nuts, the particles are too big to be fully digested. It's a whole food. You actually end up pooping out a significant amount of those calories.
Wow.
When you eat pulverized wheat, corn, rice flour in these ultra processed foods, you're absorbing 100% of those calories. Not only that. So, I mean, a calorie is not really a calorie when it comes to nutrition facts labels. Not only that, but those calories get absorbed really rapidly and really high up in the small intestine. So it basically sends your blood sugar through the roof before your body really even has an ability to, you're still eating while your body is like, what do we do with this sudden, influx of sugar, essentially. So I think it's important to avoid foods that are based predominantly on those kinds of grains.
Very, very interesting. So a couple of things on going in our mouths again. I've heard you talk about baby broccoli or broccoli sprouts. And this is like, some people think this is splitting hairs, but it's not. I don't understand, is it like sulfatine or the NRF2 pathways, whatever the heck it is, but I know a little bit, right? Why is baby broccoli or broccoli sprouts way better than like broccoli in particular? Why eat that?
That's a good question. So when you chew broccoli sprouts or any cruciferous vegetable, you basically break apart the cell walls where two chemicals that are kept in isolation in the plants unite in your mouth to create a new compound. And that compound, in the case of cruciferous vegetables, is called sulforaphane. And sulforaphane.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's considered an insect, like an insecticide, a natural insecticide that plants create, right? Because plants can't, tooth and nail their way out of being eaten, right? So what they do is they practice chemical warfare. And so they create these compounds that if you were a smaller critter, maybe an insect, a mouse, a mold, the compound would make you sick. And so, when a mouse gnaws on these plants, it creates these compounds. Sulforaphane is just one of them, but there's, the plant kingdom is just full of these like natural defense chemicals. What we see is that sulforaphane in somebody like you or me, a big, robust organism, actually has a number of beneficial and protective effects via a mechanism called hormesis. So hormesis is when you consume a plant compound, and if you were to consume a lot of it, it would be toxic, but in small doses it actually has a beneficial effect, sort of like a counterintuitive beneficial effect, because here we have this toxic chemical, but in small doses it's actually good for you. The same thing actually applies to exercise. You could exercise enough where it would kill you, right? It's a stressor on the body, but in small doses exercise actually makes you more robust, more resilient. We can, sing the praises about exercise, for hours. But sulforaphane is great because it's been shown to increase levels of a compound in the body called glutathione, which is it's the body's master detoxifier, master antioxidant. It's being studied now as a means of, its cancer protective effects. It's also been suggested in a small clinical trial, I believe, to reduce symptoms of autism. So for anybody that has that in the family, I think it's worth looking into. It's just one of the many benefits of eating a varied diet that includes cruciferous vegetables.
Okay, glutathione. I love glutathione. So I can't explain this. I'd like you to explain it to me. So I haven't done it in a while just because of COVID, but with all my traveling and I get depleted, I do IV therapy, even just sometime to get hydrated. I'll take IV hydration. One, I'd like your opinion on that. Actually, two, what's your opinion on that? Am I just peeing it all out or does it help? But here's what I know. When they put glutathione in my IV, something amazing happens to my body. There's a calming effect. I can feel that. I feel B12 when they put it in, you get all wired. The other stuff I don't really feel. For some reason, glutathione, I can feel better actually when it's in my body. So do you recommend someone supplements with it? Why is that happening, or am I crazy? And what do you feel about IV therapy?
Yeah, I don't really recommend, I don't make the recommendation that people supplement with glutathione. I mean, I have I take sometimes liposomal glutathione supplements, but I'm pretty convinced that, supplements should be used very diligently and deliberately, based on your diet and your specific, deficiencies and, even in some cases genes. But no, I generally don't recommend that people, supplement with it. I just don't think that you need to if you're eating a diet that is supplying the raw materials for your body's own glutathione synthesis. So sulfur containing amino acids is very important. Grass-fed beef, eggs, things like that. Anything with sulfur in it is actually going to be really good for you. Sulfur is a rate limiting, element in the synthesis of glutathione. And so when you consume, for example, cysteine rich, foods, you're going to basically be supplying that. Also glycine is really important. So it's one of the reasons why I think collagen is worth consuming, and collagen is actually a supplement that I think is worth looking into because we don't tend to eat a lot of collagenous tissues at this point.
Can you stay on that? You don't think that you break down those supplements in your stomach and you're never getting any benefit to taking something like, I've had other people tell me, hey, you're taking a collagen supplement, you're not getting any of it. It's destroyed before it gets to you.
Yeah, you do break it down. So it's not a one-to-one, it's not like you consume collagen and it becomes collagen in your joints.
Yeah.
But you are increasing your supply of glycine, which we don't consume enough of. Your average person consumes about 2 grams of glycine every single day. And you create in your body another 2 grams of glycine. And, and that is why glycine is actually not considered an essential amino acid, because we create it to some degree. But I don't think that we create enough for optimal health, especially today when we consume lots of muscle meat. And the reason for that is, so there have been research calculations that speculate that we need about 15 grams of, it depends on, your weight and what you're eating, but about 15 grams of glycine a day. And that our needs for glycine increase with higher consumption of another amino acid, methionine, which is more present in muscle meat. And we use glycine to create collagen. So by not consuming adequate glycine, again, we only ingest about 2 grams of it every single day. You might be actually limiting your body's ability to create collagen. And collagen is super important. I mean, it's important for, it's like the most abundant protein in the body, and and production of it declines as we get older. It's important for the health of your veins, your arteries. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think if you're not eating collagenous tissue in animal products, I think it's worth supplementing with.
Okay. By the way, thank you. I told everybody in the beginning to be like feverishly writing notes. The cool thing about this show is they listen to it in their car like, all right, well, I'm going to listen to it. I got to go all the way back and get a notepad out and start writing all this stuff down. So I really appreciate it. And for me, I'd say I'm borderline obsessed with my own health, just because there is dementia in my family. Uh, I don't know that, frankly, it's so long back. I don't know if it was dementia, a particular form of dementia, Alzheimer's specifically, but it's there, and certainly heart disease as well. And I like that you're telling us some of these markers that we can test for. How do you feel about eating less or less frequently? So intermittent fasting has been a very popular thing. I had Dr. Ian Smith on, who's written a book on it. Or just gaps in between consumption of food. Is there a benefit to the brain to doing that, to the body to doing that, or you don't subscribe to that?
No, I first became interested in intermittent fasting when I discovered the work of Mark Mattson over at NIH, who was one of the early pioneers in this field, looking at what happens in the brains of fasted mice. And what we see is that when fasted, there's an increase in levels of BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a protein that helps ensure the survival of your existing neurons while also promoting the growth of new ones, which is pretty important. That basically right there underlies the characteristic that we call neuroplasticity. So the ability of your brain to change and stay youthful over time as you get older, right? Which is something that we all want. I know a lot of clinicians now who are using fasting as a tool for neuroprotection. At the very least, fasting is going to allow you to spend more time in a low insulin state. So we already talked about insulin.
Yeah.
And so, its ability to help sensitize you to insulin, I think is potentially very useful. It's also a tool for calorie control, certainly for people. And I also think that in light of circadian biology, which we touched on a little bit earlier in the chat, I think it makes sense to have a somewhat constrained eating window today where you're not eating too close to bedtime. And research has shown us that independent of weight loss, because ultimately, calories in, calories out is sort of, will dictate whether or not you gain or lose weight. But independent of that, it seems to be the case that earlier dinners, like what's called early time restricted feeding, and a longer fasting window, actually can have benefits to your blood sugar control, and your blood pressure. And these are both all, as I mentioned, really important when it comes to preserving the health of the brain.
It also helps with sleep, doesn't it, Max? I mean, if you're digesting food prior to, you're digesting heavy when you're asleep, your body is really not at rest, right?
It's not at rest. Yeah, well said. You have a master clock in your brain. And I talk about this in depth in my most recent book, The Genius Life, because circadian biology is such a fascinating topic. And it's so exciting because we're just at the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the full breadth of its implications. But yeah, I mean, so this master clock in our brain, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's housed in the hypothalamus. So these are big words, but basically the hypothalamus is like, the hypothalamus is where it's the sort of hub of some of our most primordial drives in the brain. Okay. And so it makes sense that this master clock would be there because it's part of, we've had since well before we were human beings, we've had a relationship with light and darkness, the sun, that diurnal rhythm, that every single organism from the dawn of time on Earth has had to forge a relationship with. And so that clock is set primarily through the light that is allowed or not or unable to enter our eyes. But we also have what are called peripheral clocks throughout our body. And those organs are primarily the organs of digestion. And they're flipped on or off depending on whether or not they're actively digesting food. And so if you're digesting food late at night, you're basically confusing those peripheral clocks in your body. And they just don't, you'll always be able to digest food no matter what time of day you eat it. But it just, I don't think the system works as well. For example, like the passage of contents through your GI tract slows down the later on it gets. I already mentioned that we're less insulin sensitive at night. So the machinery responsible for metabolism isn't working as efficiently at night. So I think there are many good arguments to be made as to why you should not eat too late at night. But of course, it's like if it's your favorite thing on earth to eat that cookie like before you go to sleep, or whatever it happens to be, then it's probably not the end of the world,
I love that that's how you approach all of this stuff. Okay, some rapid fire stuff on that. So we talk about intermittent fasting, which is like a long window of 12 to 16 hours you're not eating. I think you've made obviously very good points about not eating prior to going to bed. I've been reading a little bit more about, even though it may not be that 12 to 16 hour window, not eating right away upon rising. Even if you can go an hour or two. I mean, I to be honest with you, I get up, boom, I'm eating. And I've been reading about this and that there may be some benefits to not doing that. Is that something you subscribe to as well, waiting an hour or two, or you think that's not relevant if you didn't eat before you went to sleep?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth waiting an hour or two. I don't think that there's really any biological need for breakfast. At least to eat first thing in the morning. The first meal of the day is always going to be breakfast because it's the meal at which you break your fast. But no, generally I like to not eat immediately upon waking because, first thing in the morning, a lot of people are actually they're already, burning fat. Like fat oxidation is higher in the morning because your insulin is going to be the lowest. Typically when you first wake up. That's why you do that fasting insulin draw. And so that allows for a perfect opportunity to burn fat, first thing in the morning. And that I think is an important thing, to get your body sort of primed to be a good fat burner. Not eating immediately upon waking, I think is a beneficial strategy. And then if you're able to, what?
I just have to laugh. I'm laughing at myself as you're saying that, brother. I'm 49 years old. My whole audience is now going to unsubscribe to me when I admit this to you. Please, we're having this very detailed conversation about nutrition, food, the brain, lipoprotein A, particle size. Do you know that I never knew breakfast meant break your fast? I never knew that. I'm wondering how many people in the car, am I the only grown adult in the world that did not know breakfast meant break your fast? How the hell did I not know that? So if everyone's
Learn
like,
something new every day.
If everyone's sitting there going, so Mylett does a whole show on all these fats and stuff, but his breakthrough is breakfast means break your fast. So for those of you that thought some of this was over your head, some of the bigger things aren't over my head, but some of the basic things definitely are. I'm going to ask you a question. You're on Instagram the other day. You showed like 2 salads. One was like just greens, right? And one looked to me like greens with some fats in there also. And the gist was the green one's bad and doesn't do you any good. And this one that has both is better. Why?
Yeah. So some of the most valuable compounds in plants are. So there are many reasons for that. First of all, if you're just eating greens, I mean, that's like rabbit food, right? That's not going to be satiating. It's like, I feel like that's kind of like what diet culture likes to promote. I think salads are amazing. In fact, I advocate for the consumption of a big fatty salad every single day. That's one of my sort of hallmark, pieces of advice to people. Research out of Rush University actually tells us that people who eat a large bowl of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger. So right there, that's a good rule to set for yourself. Just eat a big salad every day. It's satiating. You're going to check off many of your nutritional boxes in doing that. Great source of fiber, great source of micronutrients, and always add a protein, right? Like always add, whether it's grass-fed beef, wild salmon, chicken, eggs, whatever. But another really important thing that I talked about in that Instagram post is that some of the most important compounds that are in plants are what are called carotenoids. Carotenoids are just some of the many pigments that you'll see when you look around in the produce section of your local supermarket, the yellows, the oranges, the greens. Many people are familiar with beta carotene, which is a carotenoid, but 2 in particular that I think that in my work I've tried to bring to light are lutein and zeaxanthin. So these are carotenoids that have long been known for their ability to protect the eyes as your eyes age. If you look on the back of any sort of eye-focused nutritional supplement, you'll always see lutein and zeaxanthin because lutein and zeaxanthin, we know, accumulate in the eyes, which your eyes are an extension of your brain. Your eyes actually contain neural tissue. And those 2 compounds can help prevent age-related macular degeneration. But what we now also know about these 2 compounds is that they accumulate in the brain. They help your brain work more efficiently. They help your brain work faster. And they're abundant in dark leafy greens like kale, spinach, arugula. The problem is that you need fat to absorb them. So if you're eating a salad with a fat-free dressing on it, which many people, I think continue to do to this day, those compounds are just going right through you. Whereas with the addition of some fat like extra virgin olive oil or grass-fed beef, you're absorbing all of those very important carotenoid compounds.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just very interesting. You also have those carotenoids in the fat of grass-fed beef, in egg yolks, but grass-fed beef and egg yolks are obviously also rich in fat. So they're like perfect foods when it comes to the brain. But kale, dark leafy greens, they need a little extra boost. You know, they need that additional fat source. Otherwise, you know, some of the most beneficial compounds in those plants basically just pass right through you.
Man, so good. See, that's why Max is Max right there. A couple more things, then we'll talk about the Genius Life really quick. I want to ask you about saunas. I've been using them lately. Didn't know why I was doing them. Then I'm researching you, and it's like he talks about saunas. What's the benefit to, if any, to a regular sauna on a weekly basis?
Saunas are incredible. I actually, you know, one of the gifts that I gave to myself, one of the more extravagant purchases I made, I bought myself a sauna because the research on it really is very compelling. It predominantly comes from University of Eastern Finland. Finland is the sauna capital of the world. So I don't know if you know this, Ed, but on average, they have about one sauna per household in Finland. It's like a shower there. It's just super common. Yeah, sauna is actually a Finnish word. I think in a past life I was probably Finnish because I just love it that much. But so the research that they're doing in that part of the world is really compelling. What they're showing us is that regular sauna use with like a dose response effect, meaning the more you do it, the stronger the benefit seems to be. There you get a dramatic risk reduction for cardiovascular disease, for stroke, for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And I think I think there are many reasons for this, but I think it's most easy to see that when you sit in a sauna, your pulse increases. When you're sitting in a sauna is actually the best workout you can get while sitting absolutely still. It's a mild sort of aerobic exercise mimetic, is what it's called. Your heart rate increases. You get this full body expression in nitric oxide release, which opens up your blood vessels. It increases blood flow all throughout your body. It activates what are called heat shock proteins, which have been shown to sort of help proteins like tau in the brain from protect them against misfolding, which can happen. You know, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, they're called proteinopathies because they involve proteins that misfold and they become tangled up. And heat shock proteins, which are activated in saunas and also with exercise, can actually prevent that sort of misfolding in that pathology. So I'm a huge fan of saunas, and I think that they're you know, any opportunity you have these days to sweating is another benefit. I mean, when you sweat, you release all kinds of toxins that you accumulate, you know, just partaking in the modern world. And so it's one of the many, I think, benefits of them.
That's huge. I almost wish I stuck that in the very beginning, because I think that's something most people aren't talking about. It's ironic that tomorrow I'm going to this place that they put you in a sauna, and then you do like an infrared stretching thing under heat as well after you do the sauna. And I'm super curious as to what that's going to be like. They were just referred to me. All right, we've covered a bazillion things here today. If you had to say, hey, here's one more thing somebody could change, they could start making right now that would, you know, improve their overall health, reduce their chance of getting dementia, Alzheimer's, heart disease, just overall wellness. Is there some other thing, big or small, that people could be doing? We've talked about intermittent fast. We've talked about sleep. We've talked about all these different things. We've talked about baby broccoli even. So what's one other change somebody could implement right now that would just improve everything for them?
Well, I would say, you know, one thing we haven't touched on that I think is really important, especially today, is to find ways of healthily managing your stress. And I like to talk about two ways of doing this. So the first way is to remove the stress, right? That's the most obvious way to deal with stress, but sometimes you can't do that, right? So when it comes to being in a bad relationship or working in a job that you don't like, and that's stressful, obviously, you can end both of those situations and you'll be better off, right? But for some things that are just simply not avoidable, like having a sick loved one in the family, which I know all too well. I know what that's like all too well. You can't end that situation on demand, right? So the other way that I like to talk to people about, you know, at least to have in the back of their heads, is to boost your resilience to that stress. So you could either remove the stress or you could boost your resilience to that stress. So for example, when my mom was at her sickest, and my mom passed away 2 years ago, if I didn't carve out time in the day to get to the gym and practice self-care for myself, I don't know how I would have survived that experience. So I think for anybody listening who's in a stressful situation, make sure to prioritize self-care, to continue going to the gym, having those workouts, sitting in the saunas, doing, taking cold showers, cold water immersion, even practicing intermittent fasting. What happens when we do any of these things, it's called cross adaptation. There's a spillover effect where the adaptation that we basically cause our bodies to basically undergo when we sit in these when we endure these acute stressors, that spillover effect makes us more robust and more resilient in other areas of our lives. So psychological stress, we're actually better able to deal with psychological stress when we become more physically robust. And so I think, today we live in stressful times, and, there's this, in the wellness world, sometimes we like to, or not me, but, there's a lot of like, just get rid of the stress, sometimes the approach is very privileged, and like, and not realizing, not sort of being mindful of the fact that some people have like life situations that they can't just opt out of,
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so,
one thing you do say that I like too is that the different types of stress, that there's this benefit to this cold idea that you talked about, right? Putting yourself in a cold shower, a cold plunge is like that sort of acute stress. Actually, there's a health benefit in your body to doing so. And so not all stress is bad, but this idea of self-care, especially for me, brother, during COVID and during these times, not just COVID, but the political unrest and the social change that's taking place, it's just a lot on people. And so I'm really glad that you added that to the table. I want to ask you a question though, because we're running out of time. And I told you we could go 3 hours, but so The Genius Life, why should I get that book if I'm listening to this or watching this right now? What am I going to learn about in that book that we've not talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, if you were able to derive any value from this conversation, The Genius Life is just packed with the little things that you can do every day that are going to add up to big health wins. So from the standpoint of circadian biology, of your relationship to nature, your relationship to temperature, your relationship to light, your relationship to food, it's just packed with little ways that you could tweak almost every area of your life for noticeable health and well-being improvements. Every chapter is sort of broken apart. At the end, I offer what I call field notes so that, it becomes really easy and accessible and achievable for people. But it really is a full 360-degree sort of lifestyle plan that is, that really is going to, I say in the subtitle, heal your mind, strengthen your body, and become extraordinary. And that's really what I offer. I think mental health is crucially important. I know this firsthand as a civilian, dealing with, a sick loved one. Strengthen your body. I've seen what frailty can do to a person. I've seen I've seen true illness, which, is a, tragedy, but also a privilege that, I don't think many in the health community have seen. And so it's given me a unique take on life and what I think we ought to prioritize. And become extraordinary, like the kinds of values that you instill in your audience, to your listeners. I try to do the same thing with my readers, and a lot of them I've been able to glean from my mom, who I think, I'm biased, but I think she did a pretty good job in raising me, and making sure that I, dedicated my life to helping others and projecting empathy into the world and the like. So the book really kind of has all of that wrapped in under one sort of heading, if you will.
Yeah, it's I got to tell you what's been going on in the back of my mind. I don't know why I just get emotional saying this to you, but one of the things that's been in the back of my mind as you've been talking the whole time is, man, is this man honoring his mother with his life? And I just want to acknowledge you for that, brother. You're really honoring your mother so beautifully through the way that you speak about her, but the difference, you've taken her difficult situation and turned it into millions of other lives that you served. What a way to honor your mother. And most of you, there's an example, there's all kinds of lessons today, but the bigger one I'd love you to be looking at is that, there's people in your life you could be honoring with the work you do. And that's what Max is doing. The other thing, Max, I love about you, I just want to say, when I was preparing for the interview, I was telling some people about you that didn't know you. Obviously, we have lots of mutual friends that even connected us. But the interesting thing was, what I love about you, brother, is I can't say, well, he's a lot like so-and-so. You're your own unique man, your own unique content that people do not get anywhere else. This kind of information, this delivery, the way you do it with genius, to phrase you, but with humility and easy to understand as well. There's one of you. And that's why I want everybody to follow you. I want them to get the book, both books, and I want them to take a look at your podcast, because I think there's some value there for them as well, ongoing in their lives. So I just wanted to say thank you, brother. Today was extraordinary, unbelievably detailed, and the hour flew by. We've already done an hour. So thank you so much for being here, bro. Yeah. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah. And everybody, remember this: share the show. We're the fastest growing show in the world for a reason, because you guys share it with people that you care about. Every week I bring you somebody who has maxed out their life. Max has maxed out these areas of his life and is honoring his mother with doing this work. And I hope that you're ready to honor somebody in your life. Remember, every day on Instagram, I run the Max Out 2-minute drill, right? I make a post at 7:30 Pacific time every day, 5 days a week. Turn your notifications on. You make a comment during that. You're in a drawing every day to win something. If you miss the first 2 minutes, just make a comment on every post I make every day at any time. If you reply to other people's comments, it increases your odds. I have not missed a week in years where we pick winners that get an autographed copy of my book, go on my jet, go to speaking events, meet my guests, get one-on-one coaching by me, max out gear. And I'd love to connect with you as well. So share the show and engage with me on Instagram as well. God bless you all. Max out. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. If you'd like more, click the videos right here. They're exactly what you need to see next. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and become a part of the Max Out community. And tell me what you think about the videos in the comments below. I read all of them every week, and I select winners that get all kinds of prizes, gear, coaching calls with me. Make a comment.